Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University for Provocations. This is a live interactive academic event which seeks to shed light on the competing visions for future sustainabilities. My name is Catherine Daniel and I'm a professor here at the ANU and your facilitator for today's event. Before we begin, and I acknowledge our distinguished guests here today, can I first acknowledge and celebrate the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. These are lands that have never been ceded and will always remain sacred. And we acknowledge that sustainable futures have been built here for millennia, and that this community remains enormously important to the futures we continue to create here together. Now, for the first iteration of our series, I'm delighted to welcome Cathy McGowan, a former independent MP for Indi and a key leader in Australia's grassroots politics movement. In 2013, Cathy McGowan became the first independent candidate to be elected to the Northeast Victorian electorate of Indi, breaking up a period of major party domination in the region, which reached all the way back to federation. Her grassroots community-based campaign gained nationwide attention and demonstrated the possibility of a new course in Australian democracy. And in 2019, Cathy again created history by successfully handing over the electorate to another independent candidate, Dr. Helen Haynes. So, ta-da! Yeah, so since the handover, Cathy's continued to campaign for her vision of how politics ought to be conducted and actively encouraging communities to turn up, speak up and step up to leadership. So we're extremely pleased that she's taken up the invitation to kickstart off this series for us. Now, in terms of the format for today, the event will begin with a provocation from Cathy discussing the future of Australian democratic politics, how significant grassroots community campaigns will be in this future, and the mechanisms required for such a future to arise. Now, this will be followed by responses from and discussion between our provocatees. We have Dr. Pierrick Chalaye and Dr. Deborah O'Connell, and I'll briefly introduce them later, and of course discussion with Cathy. And finally, there will be an opportunity to engage in live Q&A afterwards with the audience about these different futures and what could underpin them. I would like to note that today's proceedings are being recorded for public distribution and they're being simulcast on Zoom currently, so please keep that in mind should you like to engage in the discussion. Thank you so much, Cathy, and with those brief introductions, I'd love to invite you to give your publication.
Thank you very much, and thank you. And I also join in acknowledging the traditional owners of this nation and the country we're on, particularly today. So I want to do three things. I want to talk about what happened. I want to talk about what meaning I made of it and open up some ideas for what others might make of what happened. So about 10 minutes worth of content. And the thing that happened was an idea that we gave birth to. Now, there's nothing original about that. So the idea grew out of emotions, anger, dissatisfaction, disillusionment, and a group of people coming together and saying, we could have it better. And then they looked to themselves and said, well, if it's going to be, well, me and us. So what did they do? They used the concept of democracy as a vehicle to engage in politics around issues that they thought were important. Now, that's not a new idea, but it was new to us. We'd never done it before in a very pragmatic way. And we hadn't done it before because we were terrified. We thought we might be shot. We thought we'd definitely lose contracts with government contracts. And we thought we'd get into enormous trouble. But as it is, when the pain of staying the same is too great, you can find the motivation to do something about it. And I think that's what happened to us. So I want to put emotion and pain fairly on the table. So what did we do? In 2013, we, being a group of 12 people to start with, organised and ran a community engagement process that grew to 500 people in 2013. In 2016, we ran another campaign, about 800 or 900. Helen Haynes ran in 2019 with something like 1,800 people. And I've been out campaigning all this week, and there's a good 2,000 people engaged. And for example, on Tuesday, I was in the little township of Myrtleford, where 30 people, raining, pouring day, got together to door knock in one particular community. So people had gathered from near and far to be part of it. And then next week, there'll be 100 people do the same thing in Wodonga. So practical political engagement in big P politics. So what we did worked. I got elected, the community got a voice, they had a lot of fun, they surprised themselves by how much they enjoyed politics. They learnt an enormous amount, and they went on to take those learnings to do actions on other issues. For example, in Yakandanda, the tiny community set up a totally renewable Yakandanda organisation, which then grew into a Indigo Power company that buys and sells renewable energy. Another group decided that they wanted to have a big fight with the Australian Rail Track Corporation about where the inland freight new line would go through their town. The ARTC, they took it on and they won that battle, getting the ARTC to move the train line out of the town. So there's been numerous examples where the skills and the networks and the leadership that grew through the campaign have now been taken up in other areas. So what happened in the beginning was an invitation to be involved in politics. People just didn't come forward, they had to be asked. There was clarity about the purpose, the values and the behaviours. And we had a very specific time frame for an end point. The election 2013, the election 2016, 2019, 2022. So there was an end task. There were clear principles. The principles were of participating in democracy. And as you all know, democracy is not a spectator sport. If you can't do it from the sidelines, or you can, of course, but then you get what you're given. So what we did was invited people to become engaged and participate in democracy, as opposed to, oh, we're just a safe seat, we can't do anything, and if we get on the field, we'll be bashed up, which was our previous attitude. So we changed that. So we had a principle of participatory democracy. We had a principle of listening to people, that democracy actually was for everybody, and it wasn't actually about what you thought, it was what other people thought. So you had to engage in active listening. It was about representation of a community. And while I got the initial job, there was a whole stack of other people who also took up responsibility for representation. We created an environment of belonging, and it was a fundamental principle that everybody belonged to Indi, like that was obvious, but everybody could play a role and be part of the activity. So in providing activities for people so that they could find a place where their skills were used and making it inclusive. And we also devolved leadership, really deliberately made sure that there was opportunities for many people to become leaders. They didn't have to be appointed. Someone could articulate a problem. If they could get a group of people together to become the solution, they were then empowered to do whatever they needed to do. So you all know the theory. But what we did was we applied it to politics, and we won. First by a little bit, then by a lot more, then by a lot. So I want to talk, I'm happy to talk more about that, but that's not the end of what happened. Is other people heard about it and said, we want some of that too. And again, it's like land care, you know, it's a good idea, it works. So I could say, sitting here today, that there are 23 for the House of Reps, community independents running in this next election. From Groom in Queensland, well, I'm excluding Tassie from that, but Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and WA. And if you look at, on average, for those community independents, they've got at least 500 active volunteers, this House of Reps, at least 500 active volunteers. So you do the maths, 23 by 500 active, engaged people out there now in a voluntary capacity, unpaid, door knocking, putting up signs, writing letters to the paper, ringing people up, actively engaging in politics with a big P. Like, who would have thought? And now there's 23, but there's about another 10 that didn't quite get their act together, learning the ropes, but will probably run next time. So what meaning do I make of this? I am totally surprised. So when Kate said, would I like to come today? I said, yes, please, because we don't really know what it means because we're in the middle of it. But if it should happen on May the 21st, that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these people get elected, we are going to be very surprised. I'm going to be very surprised and very delighted. So there's going to be some meaning that other people are going to make of the independent movement. And I was really pleased to come here and talk to you because I think we need to make our own meaning and not leave it to the mainstream media to do it. So what meaning do we make of it? But I think, from my experience, that people are desperately interested in politics, not just because of what it does to them, but they want to be invited to be engaged. Politics can be engaging, it can be fun. And when you make a process of belonging, of what we've got in common rather than what we've got in difference, people flock to it. And they bring their skills and their resources and their attitudes to it. They bring their music and they bring their art. Democracy provides a really useful vehicle for engaging with people. Now, I didn't know that. I thought Landcare was a vehicle. I thought the women's movement was a vehicle. I was always too scared to actually think that my vote and engaging people in how we vote could actually create a sense of fun, joy, delight, evangelical movement, if you want. So what we did in Indi is, in the process of being picked up by a whole lot of other groups who are saying, well, we like the basic idea, but you won't give us a recipe, because we say there's no recipe. But we say, here's what we did, and you know how to do this. There's no secret to what we've done. Go and do it in your own community. So the mainstream media constantly ring me up and say, well, why didn't you target somebody in Higgins? And I said, well, no one targeted anybody. If there was no community base there, it's not happening. Or why are you targeting all the liberals? I'm saying, well, no one's targeting anybody. There's no list. There's no one pulling strings. This is really people wanting it, feeling that sense in themselves that it's so bad we need to do something. So that means something about politics, the state of where we are, but it also means something about people's willingness to engage. So I think what it was in Indi, that we thought globally and we acted locally. Like, nothing new in that. I think in Indi that we decided we wanted to be the change that we wanted to see for us. So we stopped trying to get other people to change. We said, we're not going to try and get grants, no grants. We're not going to try and get government to be, well, we'd spent years trying to get government to change and not doing it. So us being the change worked. And then I think the third one is think globally, act locally, being the change. And we all decided to bloom where we were planted. You know, let's not go away and try and bloom somewhere else. Let's just create a space in our own community that could be better. And so finally, the provocation. Something profound has happened in my life and in the life of, I'd say, 23,000 other people going, whoa, this is important. And I think the other thing that's happening is that it's real politics around real issues that people are running on. So an integrity issue. Like, it's not the major parties that's saying we need an integrity issue. It's the independents, it's Helen Haynes going to battle against every known force in the country and making an election issue. It's the environment and climate change. We're not being led by the major parties about climate action. It's the independents, Zali Steggall, who got the legislation before Parliament. Now, we haven't got it agreed to yet, but it's been the independents who have done the work and done the thinking. So profound that the independents not only can do it, but do it so well. And the major parties are so bereft of their ability to do it. So what does that mean for us? I don't actually know, but it gives me enormous hope that at the next election, there'll be 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 candidates who represent their communities, who are people of enormous sense of duty and service, old-fashioned values, I know, who have promised to represent their communities. And that's where their integrity lies. So I have come today because I have great hope for this nation, that it could be bigger than just the meaning we make of it could be more profound than just what I've said. And that if we can take inspiration for what a small group of people have done in a small space of time, what we really could do about creating a vision for this nation that's beyond the colonial past that we recognise in that acknowledgement of country, a way of being as a nation that truly values its democracy and its participation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cathy. Thank you for sharing your stories and those emotions. And I know there's a huge amount of food for thought and material there that we'll be able to dig into. I'm now interested in the responses of our provocatees, and I'm going to turn first to Dr. Deborah O'Connell from the CSIRO. Deb leads global research in the areas of resilience, adaptation pathways and transformation of social ecological systems, and has a strong interest in designing and applying contemporary scientific and engagement approaches to complex real-world problems. She takes a systems and a creative approach to building successful partnerships and collaborations with a range of people across disciplines and organisations, and some of her current work focuses on enabling investment in climate and disaster resilience. So very topical. Thank you so much, Deb.
No worries, thank you. I'd like to pay my respects to the Langur and Ngambri people as well, and acknowledge their custodianship of the land and the leaders. I think I might start with somewhere different from when you introduced me, which is my deeply personal story, which is also very political. I grew up, I was born in Zimbabwe. It was at that stage called Northern Rhodesia, and I was born in the year that Northern Rhodesia unilaterally declared independence from the UK. It was a secession, actually, and installed a white minority government. And as my early years unfolded, the country descended into a very brutal civil war. And the particularly interesting thing for me was that I had family on both sides of that. I had every male over the age of 16 was conscripted for 6 months a year. And I also had an uncle who was a human rights activist. And so I came from a very divided set of perspectives within family. And yet within that, there was a lot of love in our family, and we managed to hold those family bonds together even through that very difficult period. My uncle had to seek asylum towards that end of that war and was brought back as the Commissioner for Justice and Peace when Mugabe came in. The first thing he did was report on the slaughter of 20,000 Adabili and released that to the Red Cross. He was thrown in jail for his trouble and eventually became part of the opposition party in Zimbabwe, the NDC. But again ended up in exile for his latest years because the threat of assassination became too strong. So I think that's given me, I've chosen a career in science, but it's given me a very set of unique perspectives about some of the things that you talked about, Cathy. Creating that sense of belonging and compassion and listening to the different perspectives, each of which hold their own truths. despite the conflict that you may see emerging. And I try and apply that as a philosophy in the science that I do, because of course the work that I do has to be evidence-based, it has to be testable, it has to be repeatable. So in working where I work now, which is in climate and disaster resilience, we can see now that, you know, the warnings over the last 20 years are now becoming patently manifest, and we've been told on very established authority. We've probably got 3 years to turn the ship around. At the same time as these catastrophic impacts are starting to become very real. And I think that this opens up a really emotional, contested space in which we can choose pathways to descend into conflict, or we can choose pathways to understand the futures that we face if we do nothing, and the futures that we face if we choose to shape the future differently. But in doing that in a way that brings people together and respectfully finds pathways that will benefit everybody. It will take collective action, and there are a whole range of methods that we can use to inspire and catalyse that. So I'll leave it now.
Great, thank you so much, Deb. And yeah, again, a huge number of really important themes that are coming out here around, you know, emotion, contested space, how we do better to build those futures together. We will hear from our second provocateur. I'd just like to introduce Dr. Pierrick Chalaye, who is a social scientist in the School of Engineering at the Australian National University. Pierrick obtained his PhD in comparative environmental politics and policy from the University of Canberra last year. And his research interests include energy and environmental politics and policy, deliberative democratic theory and qualitative research methods, and his current work focuses on exploring pathways to a just energy transition in Australia and elsewhere. Thank you so much, Pierrick. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to talk and to have sort of high-level conversation about very important matters. So you focused largely on agency, on what collective agency means, and as a Foucauldian kind of person, I'm very interested in structures that trap us and leave us sort of our feet, our legs in the mud. And I think when we and my background is in comparative environmental politics, because when we look at what Australia does. Australia scores pretty low, and I think we need to collectively acknowledge that that the pathologies that exist in Australia are very structural, are very profound. And my question, the overall question I have is whether the rise in independent candidates that we see, which is a good sign. I think it shows democratic renewal and lots of positive features, but whether it is sufficient to counteract the structures that we trapped in. So I'm just going to give a few examples of the structures that I have in mind. And there are two types. I think there's like toxic institutional pathologies in Australia. The toxic ones are, around the idea that the dominant framing is job versus the environment. And this has been going on for about at least 2 decades in Australia. The power of extractive industries in almost every sector of the economy. The highly concentrated and conservative media that Cathy pointed out before. And the growing nativist discourse, which is about making conceivable the idea that Australians should be proud of the efforts that are made on climate change or other sort of environmental issues. These are toxic structures. There are the structures that I think are about low immunity, and these are the ones that we need to cultivate collectively in order to make sense. And perhaps that responds to all the very pragmatic and practical examples that you gave. I think one common thing that I have in mind is the environmental movement and other social movements are very fragmented in Australia, a lot more than in other countries. What we've seen growing in Latin America, in some parts of Europe, in Western Africa, with this sort of the alter globalist agenda, has never sort of taken over here as it has done quite profoundly in the different regions that I've talked about. And of course, this can be linked with these growing independent candidates we're talking about. But whether this link, this international connection has been made, I think the answer is no. The other, I guess, low immunity sort of symptom that I have in mind is, around this idea of how do we develop a cross-sectoral capacity that is strong enough to defeat the extractive industries that have sometimes a monopoly on the entire sector, including unions. The sort of the positive note, and I don't think I have much time, so I'm going to end up quite quickly, is I think there are lots of positive features in Australia that we can draw on in order to build this collective future that we have in mind. The first one is there's probably one of the deepest socio-ecological history on earth in this country, and this is not a minor point for a country, but it's largely forgotten, in formal and informal politics. There's strong environmental science. Unfortunately, it's completely denied by a significant part of the political class. But the environmental science is here. And there's again, the rise of these sort of grassroots independent candidates. And perhaps finishing on my, what's the name of this event again? Provocation. So my sort of provocation is, responding to Bruno Latour's, I don't know if you're familiar with this philosopher, who calls for an ecological class. How do we form an ecological class that is as powerful as what the workers' movement has been for the welfare system? It took 100 years. And we are only at the beginning of forming an ecological class. So what are the key sort of, the key crossroads that we need to anticipate to form this class?
Great, thank you so much, Pierrick. And again, so many themes for us to explore here in terms of potential futures and the types of democracy, the structures, the pathologies, some of the challenges and the potential of these movements, and how we might bring some of those about. If I can maybe turn back to Cathy and your provocation, what do these particular perspectives from Deb and Pierrick bring up for you? I know you've spoken about the role of leadership, and I'm wondering whether you wanted to explore a little bit further in some of these challenges. What is the role of leadership in these kinds of independent movements in creating these futures? And even potentially, what do you mean by leadership in this emerging community democratic model?
Thank you. Thank you for your story. That was just lovely. And for that whole idea of a class is just really, to me, really powerful. So I do want to talk about leadership because, when you're in the middle of something and it's all messy, it's a bit like we're cooking the Christmas cake and all the ingredients on the table. We don't actually know what the cake's going to look like. So what happens if 5 or 6 get elected to Parliament? Do they just get subsumed? It's all that stuff you're talking about. So I do want to talk about leadership, and I want to just give a little analogy because something very odd happened to me in my leadership role. So I cut my teeth in politics on the women's movement, the feminist movement. In the early agri-political, I've been involved in Women in Agriculture and the National Farmers Federation. So I'd had a lot of experience in the traditional leadership roles where I had the vision and I went out and I did things. It was profoundly different when you're standing for an election. You don't start by doing things because the position of power is totally different. As a candidate standing for an election, the power lies with the constituency who's going to vote for you. So you're not actually, and as an independent, so you're not actually doing something for them and you're not paid. You're actually asking them for their vote. and then you've got to demonstrate that you should get their vote. So that sense of leadership so here was I wanting to be a leader in my community to get them to vote for me, but I couldn't tell them what to do. They didn't like that, they didn't want that because they had the vote, they had the power. So it involved me becoming, in that very traditional sense, a servant to the people, which is a totally different place to start. And that's again what's happening with these other independents. They're actually running as servants. So they go and listen, then they go and engage, and they say, I will be your servant if you elect me. So that's the offer, which is profoundly different from most other types of leadership. But in me coming to understand that I had to be of service to my community. And if I was an effective servant, I'd get re-elected. Profoundly odd. So that's why that sense of engaging in listening became so important. Like, we didn't just do it, it was a good idea. If I was going to be a servant to my people, I had to know what they wanted so I could deliver it. It's very transactional, I know, but that's how it was. So I'm now in the space where I'm watching these 23 other candidates developing a servant leadership approach to being a member of parliament, which is profoundly different to traditional ways of working in politics. So I wanted to just put that out there about leadership. And when you become a servant and you have to change your way of acting, that quote about the future's not a destination, the future's a pathway, and you make the pathways as you get involved in it, became incredibly real because I profoundly changed. My way of operating changed, my way of thinking about the world changed, my relationship with my community changed. And by the time I'd finished, I'm going to say my relationship with my community was so profoundly different that I still go to the local shop and everybody comes along and they call me Helen. Helen, I go, yeah. And what I do is I get out my phone and I take a photo of how, get them to talk, make a video. And I say, well, I'm Cathy, but why don't we make a little video of Helen? And we make a little video of the person telling me whatever they told me, and I send a video to Helen. So Helen picks up all this gratuitous love that's come my way. So I'm just telling you that little story about something about ego that's totally gone now. Like, it's irrelevant who the member of parliament is because it's the role. So I wanted to respond to what you're saying because I think that's what you do in your work. You create that sense of, well, the story about your uncle, a leader in that sense. And this whole idea of, well, where are the crossroads? And if we were going to create another way of working, what does it actually mean for us to support each other in a new leadership role? And I keep looking for models. I really do. And I go back to the traditional Christian religious groups where they did leadership. And I don't find it particularly helpful. So I suppose I keep thinking, well, where are the models that we could grow on? And the thing that we don't actually have an enemy. So this idea of servant leadership when you don't actually have an enemy, like the trade unions had an enemy, the churches had an enemy, there was always the other. Whereas what we're trying to do is leadership that's not actually about, it might be about we want to save the planet, but it's not a known enemy as such. So that's my sense of we collectively can bring it into existence by talking about this, by thinking about how we do it. And then I suppose the other thing is by not letting our leaders alone, because that's the profound thing I'll finish on, is once I became the Member of Parliament, I had made this commitment to represent my community and do what they'd asked me to do, so that sense of servant. And it was incredibly powerful. Like I wasn't giving up my power, it just changed. But what held me true when I was a Member of Parliament, when you get all those terrible temptations to succumb to the power of the job, was my community. For just a quick example, and I give you the example because of how important it is to be grounded and attached to your community and the power they've got to hold you to your promise. So the one example was when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, he was really short on numbers, and he came and offered me the job as speaker, you know, profound way of, you do that with your independents, you put him in the speaker and you get another vote on the floor. And I can remember he was very persuasive, and I was very tempted and thought, yes, I could be a really good speaker. The idea of controlling question time, I tell you, was very attractive. But as soon as I got home for the weekend and I started realising that the cost I'd pay was that I couldn't represent my community anymore, because you can't speak on the floor if you're a speaker. So they didn't want me to do that. That was a price too high. So I only had to speak to 2 people to be reminded that no amount of doing good for the country was going to take up for, that wasn't the bargain I'd made. So my community held me tight. And a bit like the balloon, if they'd let me go, if they'd stopped caring, I would have floated off into another space. So how do we as community hold our politicians to account for what they say they're going to do? And the answer isn't only in an integrity commission, and it isn't only in legislation. It's something much more profound. And I'm going to finish with what I like about France, is the civil disobedience that the French community bring to bear when their politicians don't do what they want. And I suppose I take great comfort from that, you know, the Indian experience with Mahatma Gandhi and his civil disobedience, when the English weren't doing what he thought they should do with the salt tax. And I don't want to go to civil disobedience, but it just seems to me that there's a whole stack of holding love and compassion in our hearts. But, you know, your uncle's story again is like, at the end of the day, not at the end of the day, in this story, how much will we invest in making the world the way we want it to be? So I found that story profoundly, you know, you just told us a personal story, but it's one of, are we that brave?
Sure.
If I can take my CSIRO hat off for a moment and put a different hat on. I'm also the lead facilitator for a global women in STEM leadership initiative called Homeward Bound, where we try to catalyse a network of women who know how to lead differently and know how to lead for the planet with a science and evidence-based decision-making ability. And the program is structured around, first of all, understanding that I need to change. What does it mean for me? How do I lead for me? How do I lead for we? And then how do we lead in a complex, contested, emergent future? Because all 3 of those things we need to build capability and capacity and competencies, as well as catalyse a network of trust and support to get the critical mass so that it's not just lone voices in the wilderness trying to change the world by themselves. So within that, I guess I've become a bit of a scholarship of leadership, and you described servant leadership really well. There are different, you know, you look at leadership through time, the kind of command and control style of leadership, which works within certain contexts. There's servant leadership, emergent leadership, informal and informal leadership, systems leadership, which is what we talk about a lot, and host leadership, which is creating the space, holding the space for people to be able to build their capabilities and have those conversations. And all of those styles of leadership are important, but they need to be matched to context, because there is a time and a place where command and control of leadership is really important. So if I put my CSIRO hat on again, working in disaster and climate, and working across a whole lot of different contexts, I do have the privilege of having worked with a lot of people in uniform, in emergency services, heads of police, as well as Red Cross, you know, people who are involved in disaster prevention, immediate response, recovery, and building resilience for the longer term. And it's kind of clear that people can get, as you said, stuck in one style of leadership, but actually being able to flex the sort of leadership that you have as a style and who is called on to lead at the time needs to match the context, and that needs to change. I think we're at a time now where we're in such a rapid change of context and such an emergent future that I'm really capturing that idea of systems leader. What you described, where you felt like the servant leader, but what you were also doing was enabling systems leadership. You had a really clear goal, an idea of the futures that you wanted to go. There might be some contestation because some people think, well, is it on the how part? What do we do and how, and who needs to do it is often where it's tricky. But as long as people are focused on that goal, and that's where the science can come in, what is the cause and effect logic? If you do these things, what is the cause and effect logic that it will take you to where you want to go? And when we're going into really uncharted territory, you can take your best guess, but you don't know. So you have to kind of have a really active learning orientation and constantly be reflectively asking yourself the question and reflectively responding, is this taking us in a direction that we need to go? And if not, how can we rapidly adjust and adapt as we go? And having the honesty and the courage to have that self-reflection, allow yourself to be held by the people around you, not only held to account, but held in a space that keeps you focused on where you're going.
Thanks so much, Deb. And I think those ideas of courage and who you trust, the systems, I think are so important. Cathy, I know with your electorate, you had some really interesting ways of providing space, that sort of enabling that host leadership in hosting, say, for example, volunteers in your office in Parliament House. Can you tell us a bit about how you took on some of those different roles? And I know your background in Hawkesbury, the systems, leadership, how do you see these kinds of things in your processes and practices, and what can we learn from what was done?
So I did want to explore this a little bit because it was very much a work in action. Like, we didn't know what we were doing. We had a bit of theory, and a lot of it was, we were active learners. We tried that and it worked, so let's do more of it. One of the things that provided the operating framework was young people. Because there's a whole story about it, but yeah, I made a commitment very early in the piece to represent young people in Indi. It had been our biggest export. Young people just leave the country, go to Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney. So part of the whole thing was to make sure young people's voices were heard. And so that I said I would do that. I had no idea how I could possibly engage young people in politics. We discovered how to do it to get me elected. We could engage young people in the campaign, and they were fantastic. But once I was in Canberra, like, now what do we do? And it wasn't huge numbers of young people who were interested. But anyhow, what we did was we set up this volunteer program. So I'd go out to a meeting and there'd be one young person sitting at the back and all old people. And I'd do a beeline for the young person and say, hello, Cathy's my name. What brought you here? Oh, well, I really care about global warming. Okay, what are you doing? Oh, well, I'm a tradesperson, or I'm studying, or whatever it is. And then over a period of time, I would say, would you like to come and do work experience in my Canberra office? And they would, without fail, say yes. And then they'd say, but I've got no money. I said, that's okay, no money required. So we built up this volunteer program that every week that Parliament was sitting, there was up to 4 Indi people who came and volunteered in the office. And we had an induction program. We developed a program for them. And over the time I was a member of Parliament, we had 200 people do that work experience. And then we had 5,000 young people come and visit Parliament while I was there, school kids doing it. So what happened as part of that commitment grew the volunteer program. And it was really odd how successful it was. We didn't design it to start out to be successful. It was a response to a need. But the other party, my colleagues in Parliament, Liberal Party, National Party, whatever, would come and say, oh, how do you get those people there? Do you pay them? I said, no one gets paid. We organise billets. They come up in the car with me. There's no cost involved. But how do you select them? Because they've got to select them from a party. And I say, well, it's anybody who's interested can come. Well, don't you vet them? And I say, yeah, everyone does a police check, but all they have to do is be interested. So it's self-selected. But what happened as a result of that program is that initially it was just of interest, and then after a bit it came by design. For example, a young bloke who's on the Wangaratta Council, Dave, interested, came up to Canberra, worked in the office for a week. His particular area was mental health. There'd been a whole bunch of suicides in Wangaratta, and we get talking, what can we do about suicides? I say, I'll introduce you to Greg Hunt's Chief of Staff. You can talk about what money's in the system for suicides. Dave went and met the chief of staff, not me, they went and did that. The chief of staff said, well, we've got money to invest in rural health. Why don't you go away, come back with a plan? So young Dave, council, goes back, sets up and calls a meeting, like he's 28, calls a meeting of the health service providers, all the people interested in mental health. They come up with a project plan. 4 of them come back, get an appointment with Greg Hunt, Minister. Greg gives them $2.5 million for the Wangaratta mental health facility, which is now operating. Now, there was no way knowing Greg Hunt was going to give me money because I'm not in his team, but he was going to give money to a local councillor who had done all that work. So those guys are never, ever going to forget how to work the parliamentary system. So my job was to give access and explain how it works. And you have to wear a suit and you need a brief. But that's all, that's just basic stuff. So that's a bit about the leadership and the enabling. But it's much, much more than that. It's the generosity of spirit to do the mentoring to people who know has got a need to help them work the system. And all of us could do that a lot better, I think, than what we do. And it's not about making him do something. It was about, I could see he wanted to do it himself, but he needed a little bit of something or other, friendly, loving care. You know, I call myself an aunt in that situation, a bit of aunt mentoring to work through the system. So I just wanted to tell that story because I don't see us doing nearly enough of that. That's just an example with young people. We also did it with Aboriginal people and we did it with other groups who are disenfranchised in the community. And it always worked because people's self-interest is so strong that if someone will help them with their own self-interest and put them at the centre of the activity. So that's why it comes to why I was so keen to make the point about being a servant. Like, I didn't do it for me, I did it for them, but of course it worked because the word of mouth, those young people all talking about how they got the money. And I'll just finish off with how politics works. So here's the twist of it all. So that $2.5 million came to that consortium in Wangaratta. And that the local, the member of the Senate for North East Victoria is a national person. So the way the government works, they don't give you the money if you're an independent. They bring in, they call them a duty senator, who's of the same colour to make the announcement. So in this case, it's Bridget McKenzie. So Bridget McKenzie gets the announcement that the government's going to give $2.5 million to Wangaratta for this mental health service. She's going to be in Wangaratta to make the announcement. And I don't get invited because that's how they play the politics. So Dave rings up and says, Cathy, have you heard? And I said, no, I hadn't heard. He said, well, you're coming, aren't you? And I said, of course I'm coming. And then David said, and I'll make you get a chance to speak. So he could do that because he was going to. So they corrupt the formal architecture of how the government's going to give grants because the community have got ownership of it and they wanted me to be acknowledged because even though I hadn't got the money, they could see what I'd done. And so the photo is of Bridget McKenzie and I, Bridget making the announcement, but everybody in the community going, look what Cathy's done. And I tell you what, if you want 2 choices of support from the community, you're the senator who gives money, blow in, blow out, or you're loved by all the local community because you facilitated their young people go to Canberra and get the money for themselves. I mean, that's the space you want to be in. Now, I didn't know any of that when I started out. And I probably never would have done it if I hadn't appreciated the way to get Helen Haynes elected was to have the community understand the power of a representative. And that's why when they get us all confused, it doesn't matter because it's the role that they see and know.
Wonderful. Well, I think with that, we can open up to questions. I just wanted to ask, did you have anything else you wanted to respond to before we open to questions?
It goes back to something a little bit before, so it's not the last thing that was said. So I'm always a little bit confused when I hear that we don't have an enemy. And I agree with perhaps the wording of an enemy is problematic, but we have adversaries. And I think to me that's the entire challenge is about creating that map where we identify and first, who is the we, who's part of this, who's part of the solution and who's part of the problem. What kind, if we talking about, dramatic ecological changes we're facing, what kind of activities do we need to stop immediately? What interests are behind? What ideologies are behind? Do we want to sympathize with these ideologies or these interests, or do we want to fight them? And I think these questions need to be asked quite early on at the community level.
Yeah. Oh, really? That's really useful. So when we did that for us, I isolated one of the enemies as the Murdoch press. That was very easy for us to see, but that's not subtle. So what you're saying is mapping the we and them.
Yeah, I mean, well, sorry, maybe I'm sharing something, but yeah, I've been a part of lots of these civil disobedience systems. So I'm a member of ATTAC. I don't know if you know this alter globalist organization in France, who's who's been quite vocal on the civil disobedience front, and mapping adversaries, identifying them is a key part of this engagement process. And of course, it has to be done according to everyone's capability, right? So because people can be, people can be a bit confronted by the idea of having this adversarial system, because it is an adversarial system.
Sure. So I'd like to build on that by maybe just take, as a systems scientist, what we try to do is understand how the system works. You can't describe everything about the system because it's like trying to boil the ocean, but trying to understand what are the key drivers, and particularly what are the key feedbacks, the amplifying feedbacks and the dampening feedbacks that either take you towards your goal or away from the goal. And then unpacking the who, the how, the why, and trying to design interventions at the key points in the system when you can. And I think doing that work over a long time shows us that you need to have civil disobedience in and of itself. It's not the answer. It's one key point of intervention. You need to have leaders in formal roles at all levels. In informal roles, you need to have people who are working within the system and maybe contesting the system. And you need to pressure those key points of intervention in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of levels. In order to really shift something, as you described so beautifully, so locked up and entrenched. And then when you get these periods of rapid shift that we see now, it kind of breaks some of that. So knowing where to intervene and how, with who and what, that doesn't lead to complete conflict and disintegration is actually a really, that's where the science, social science, political science and ecological, all of it, you need to have some evidence base and some logic for that, not because it'll give you the actual answer, but it'll give you the best bet. And if you combine that with quickly learning, you've got the best chance of kind of shaping the system in the way that you want it.
Beautiful. And I think that point on, where can we intervene and who and how, at what levels, I think that's a great place to start our discussion with the audience. So we are going to open to Q&A in the room and online. If I can ask you to raise your hand, we already have one question here. And you may also write through the chat. We have someone who will run around with a microphone. And please state your name and affiliation prior to asking your question. Thank you so much. So I think we have a first, sorry.
Jamie it's a question up online about training, so maybe we'll start with that. And then we'll go to... That's fine,
yeah. Thank you.
So the question was for Cathy, environmentalists and farming communities are often seen as being at odds, but their interests increasingly align, especially things such as climate change action, payments and ecosystem services, that sort of thing. Could Cathy outline opportunities she sees for environmentalists and farming communities to work better together in the public interests?
Well, as our Prime Minister constantly says, I don't accept the premise behind the question. I don't think farmers and environmentalists are at odds. I think the National Party puts a view out there, and the National Party likes defining itself by not being green. And if the biggest insult can be in a regional electorate is they accuse you of being a greenie, and it could take 3 or 4% of your vote. So, but that's all the politics of the National Party. I don't see any evidence that the farming and regional Australia is not caring of its environment. Truly, I mean, land care groups, for example, land care groups cover the whole country. So that's one indicator of just volunteer effort. Farmers for Climate Action, really, really popular organisation doing lots of work. And the final bit, coming back to my thesis about political action, I know of six of these groups out of the 23 are running in National Party seats, and they're all running on a, I'm going to call it environment, not necessarily climate agenda. So you've got Mallee, you've got Nichols, which is Mallee, Mildura, Nichols, which is Shepparton, the two Northern Rivers seats, Page and Cowper, Riverina, another one, Groom in Toowoomba. So these are, and that people just think the movement's teal, which is Sydney and Melbourne, but it's really strong in the country. So I just think there's just a huge change going on. And maybe in the past that was perhaps, there was this more perceived sense of rural people not caring about the environment, but that's totally and utterly changed with the 2020 fires and all the floods. Everybody can see it happening. So it's gone. And it gives me, so watch those electorates, Page, Cowper, Groom up in Toowoomba, Riverina, not so much, won't be so strong, but they're doing work. And then Nichols and Mallee. And then there's others down in Gippsland and Wannon. Like there's a whole lot of regional seats running, but those ones, those six are National Party ones.
Great, thank you. We have a question here.
Lisa Robbins, I'm an affiliate with the Fenner School. So wondering whether or not you think there's any connection between Indi being the birthplace of land care, or one of the main birthplaces of land care in Australia, and the Voices movement, and whether there's been any connection evident for you in the process of your term. And then secondly, talking about your stories before of the Wangaratta councillor, have you done or have you thought of doing a sort of a formal or informal sort of impact evaluation of your time to try to more formally document some of these? Because, for example, even here, I hosted one of your volunteers, and there's that knock-on effect, because that was not just good for them, that was good for us, and how many conversations we had with others about that. So you've got this sort of this trickling out effect as well, which I think it would be quite substantial.
So that was, thank you for your question, because it was why I was so keen to come today, because the answer is no, we've just been too busy head to the ground getting Helen elected. So we haven't had any capacity to do the research. So there's infinite research to be done, I have to say, on political, economic, social, and not just Indi now, but there's 23 other electorates who are doing all their own stuff. Like I've just been to Toowoomba, and it's just staggering to me, the people who are turning up to campaign for Susie Holt in Toowoomba. Like what is going on in that seat is like, whew, she needs a 20% swing, which she probably won't get, but she's definitely going to make the seat marginal right in the middle of Queensland. And it will have such a ripple out effect to those other regional seats. So yeah, come and do some research. And you ask about the connection with land care. I'd go back further and talk about Ned Kelly. So Ned Kelly's heart and soul of what you, a bit like what you're talking about, like Glen Rowan's right in the middle of this, and that sense of being badly done by government is still pretty bloody strong. And then the Catholic versus Protestant tension has been alive in that community forever. But the thing that comes through, which is why I'm so interested in your leadership example, we've got a thing in Indi, well, in Victoria, but in Indi it's called the Alpine Valleys Community Leadership Program. It's been running now for 25 years. So there's an active program, and every year 30 people, community people, do this leadership program. So we've got this really embedded leadership ethic in the community that's grown out of not only land care, but a whole other community organisation. So the community's networked, real community people, network supported, skilled up. And there's no way, no shape, they don't, it wasn't, when I first ran, I went to the Alpine Valleys Community Leadership Program and said, come on guys, will you support me? I went, oh, Cathy, bugger off, you know, we're not political. If you want graduates of the program, sure, they can individually do it, but there's no way known that we're apolitical in that sense. So they didn't come out and support the idea, and there's active argument within the leadership, it's probably not the word, about how leadership works. But I know that course and that education and capacity building at the grassroots level has made a profound difference to every single one of our institutions are now better off because of it. And actually just studying that, it'd just be such a rich vein of work to do.
Great, thank you. I think we've got one online and then we'll go to back of the room.
I got this one.
Okay, sure.
Great, thanks very much, and thank you so much, Cathy. My name is Claire Dubé. I'm the founder of a community organisation called Provocations. We spoke last year, Cathy, and I just really wanted to build on your comments around meaning and widen them further. I mean, we know this. You mentioned the 23 candidates in lower house seats here in the ACT, very much inspired by the Indi experience. My partner and I and a number of others set up an organisation called Provocations last year, which was very much along this model of having community engagement with more than 400 people last year, which led to the endorsement of a community-backed independent candidate here in the ACT, but for the Senate. And I guess, yeah, just wanting to sort of think about that meaning, that we focus on the lower house, which absolutely so important, but depending on what the parliament looks like this next round, there may be even further meaning that has come from your very, very inspiring story. And I guess, so that was just a little point to share, and I guess to echo so much around this, the reflections around doing politics differently, and the opportunities around community, and some of the models we've been using around sort of politics in the park, of inviting a suburb to kind of come together and meet and share, that is around the election, but is beyond that as well. But my question for you really is to Cathy, is there a phrase or a motto or something that you have taken with you from this journey? I guess for me, coming to it much more recently than you, the phrase that has a lot of meaning for me is Ubuntu, a sort of sense of shared humanity, of I am because we are, and something that I find a kind of powerful reminder of what we are trying to do here. But I wondered if there was any phrase or anything like that you have taken with you on this journey.
Look, there is, and it's totally linked to the future is not a destination. Like the power that I know, that if you keep going in the same direction, we're going to get where we're headed. And it doesn't have to be that way. And it's a choice to keep going in the same direction. So the future, and then if you engage in a different way, you get to make a future that's built on all those words that you talked about. It profoundly influences me. And then when we did it and it worked, and we wanted politics to be fun, because it had to be fun. And then when we made it fun, and people responded, and we made more fun. And it was like, oh my God, whoever would have thought that we're making the future now? And when I'm talking to some of the candidates who are getting underway, and I say that you've got to have your values statement. They do values, respect, and blah, blah, blah. And I say, you haven't got fun in there. Oh, well, what does fun look like? I say, well, you really need to have that discussion. Because if you don't design fun into it, it's not going to last. So I think like so counterintuitive, isn't it? You've got to build fun into it, and then you've got to know that by building fun into it, you'll build these values that you're talking about of cooperation and understanding. And
sure.
Can I add to that? So I think this is where we can try and bring some of the science to the table about the process of, I guess our team specialises in the process of social change and the process of catalysing that social change, but doing it in a way that gives you the best opportunity to reach the future that you want. And so there's a number of principles that we can show. We've demonstrated, we've worked all around the world, whether it's backblocks of Ethiopia or Papua New Guinea or higher echelons of emergency management in Australia. Often if you ask people to stand where they are and look forwards, it doesn't necessarily put them on there's so many ways to go and it can be so overwhelming. There are a number of principles about designing for future. So understanding, eliciting from people what they want that future to look like, and then doing what we call backcasting. What are the prerequisite conditions that would need to be in place in order for that future to really happen? What are the preconditions to that and the preconditions to that? Really leading right back to the activities that you would then do. You get a very different answer. So if I give you one example, say from local government, we work with a lot of asset managers. And when we come in with climate and disaster resilience, it's usually with a risk framing. So we work with people whose technical training is engineers, whose legal and mandated obligations and responsibilities are around protecting an asset. But the question that we need to ask is so much bigger. If you remember that the picture of the bridge, not Chalaye, the Woodburn Bridge from the floods in the northern rivers. Obviously, a lot of thought and a lot of science and engineering and planning and understanding the future of climate went into designing that bridge. And when the flood came, it was strong enough and big enough to withstand and be resilient, and all the horses swam to the bridge and the cars were parked on the bridge. But who's asking the bigger question about the viability of the towns and the lands that services in the longer term? Because there's no point just having this stranded asset. So if you start with now and what is my job now, what are my legal mandated responsibilities now, and yes, I know climate disasters coming, it puts you on a very different, you might think you're doing things differently, but you're not having that big picture. So what future do you want? What values does it need to deliver? What are the threats to those values? Values can shift. The things that people value can shift very dramatically with context. So if you ask people 5 years ago what they valued, it would be very different to, so I'm not talking about your held and foundational values now, but the things that you value. Be very different now to 5 years ago because those things have been threatened in the meantime. Clean air, clean water, food supply, democracy, institutional trust, for example. So holding the, understanding what things you value, how they might look in the future, and then backcasting is, one of the really simple, really scientifically supported methods to try and help achieve the sorts of things that you're talking about.
Thank you so much, Deb. We do have a question online, is that correct? And then we can continue this conversation because I think, again, those questions about resilience for what, for whom.
Before we just finish, could I go back to Claire?
Yes.
Claire, could I just pick up a couple of threads here? So it would be really useful to get some of these people to do an evaluation of PROACT. I don't mean evaluate, I mean an active, how is it all that working? So that the reflection that you're talking about, I'm sure you're doing it, but actually to be using the resources of the Fenner Centre to actually look at what's happening, and with David Pocock's campaign as well, because it's not going to stop whether or not those two people, Kim gets elected or David gets elected. The work's going to continue. So to bring the science to bear on what the next bit of the work.
We would love it. Yeah.
Thank you.
So another question online, and it's directed to all panelists. Thanks, Glenn. The influence of the fossil fuel lobby on Australian politics has been particularly notable in recent years and dominates a lot of its discourse around money and politics. Do you view this influence as a system of broader issues within the Australian political system, such as factionism or ideological foolishness, or a factor which exacerbates to these issues? How does this issue factor into your view of the future of sustainable democracy?
When I think about the fossil fuel industry and the power they've got, I use it as a salutary lesson, because they're doing exactly what I'm trying to do. Use the democratic system for their own gains. And I think right-wing conservatism is doing the same thing as well. So it constantly reminds me to be humble about the power you accumulate as you do this work, because you can get sucked in by your own sense of agency and importance. Because I would suspect that when the fossil fuel industry started out doing its lobbying, it was doing it for good intent. And they lost the anchorage of what the purpose, I suspect, if I think charitably about it. So, but and it's a bit like the churches, you know, the churches started out with good intent and they ended up down rabbit warrens you never want to go near. So I just remind myself in all this work is that being anchored to your community is a very safe place to be, because community's got its own vested interests. And if you can stay engaged with your community that's useful. So that's my bit about the fossil fuel bit, because I don't think you're going to change people's want to influence the outcome. And you can change all the rules you like and people just will find another way of getting around it.
Yeah, if I can add something on this, I guess there's a sort of high-level fossil fuel lobby that happens, you know, with sort of the formal political class. But I think there's a more informal and subtle lobby that happens at the community level. And there's been a lot of work, you know, showing how much of the local sort of collective infrastructures are owned by fossil fuel industries, and that sort of solidify their social basis in a way. So if you think of like the school shed or the community hall, sometimes it's part funded or entirely funded by fossil fuel groups. And I think to me this is probably the most perverse kind of form of lobbyism and the hardest to challenge, because you know if you don't know these things as a community and are ready to fight against it, and have allies that can fight with you against such things, I think it's very hard to get out of this.
Great, thank you. Do we have got one over here? Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael Wellington, PhD student. I have to admit I share the view of the shoppers in Indi, where I've probably got a homogenous understanding of independent members for Indi. And I think I said to someone this morning, "Oh, you coming to see Helen later?" So, and yeah, I know your story, and I'm sure your constituents know your story as well. So it struck me when you shared that experience that it runs counter to this phenomenon of identity politics and the way we think of this certain person represents a sector of Australian society because they come from this place, they've done this, they've done that. So interested in reflections from the panel on whether we place too much importance in identity in the way we think about politics.
I'm pretty humble about it, because it was shocking when it first happened, because my face was absolutely everywhere, you know, vote for her, and Helen's face is now absolutely everywhere, vote for her. How could you not see the difference? But I think they just thought, if I was quite ageist about it, I think people just go, older woman. The fact that she's blonde and I'm dark is probably irrelevant. No, it's a really interesting, and I'd be interested in what you learn about in your leadership with outward. No, it's not outward bound, homeward bound. Yeah, I think because I think I got taught when I was learning about leadership that it was about identity, it was about me. And then to be able to let that go and know that there's enormous power in it not being about you. And the other thing, I don't know who's listening to this, but you know, if it's out there, it makes me very safe as well. Because it's hard to knock me off my pedestal when you're not on a pedestal. And I mean that seriously, because this is quite dangerous work we're doing. You know, you just have to watch what's happening to some of the independents who are running in some of those urban seats. You know, they're being attacked all over the place for spurious reasons. So I sometimes think, oh, well, that's not happening to me. Well, it did when I was a member of Parliament, but it doesn't happen now. But I'm really interested in what you think about that.
You can have a go if you like. I guess identity politics is about more than the identity of the person being elected. It's also fundamentally about the identity of the individual and the identity of the community. And maybe it'd be helpful to draw on the work of Brené Brown. I don't know if any of you know Brené Brown's work, but she's a social researcher in the US. I think 28,000 interviews over how long. So it's based in America. But if I can, forgive me for simplifying for the case of brevity, you know, in times gone past, people used to live in a town. There's a lot of intra-group violence and dispute. You know, lots of murders and crime and whatever else. As we became more affluent and more mobile, if you didn't like that group that you identified with, you just went somewhere else. You could move somewhere to a different job. You could move to a different town. And the level of intra-group conflict has decreased. Of course, social media has amplified this. If you don't like that Facebook group, well, just join a different one. And so what we've seen is the intra-group conflict reduce and the inter-group conflict become completely explosive and unmanageable. And so when we're thinking about identity politics, it does really come down to a sense of belonging. Some of the things that humans really crave, just wanting to belong, to feel valid, to feel valued. And if you're living in a society where you can't sit down and listen respectfully, you have no safe spaces for dialogue to talk about hard things, it means that it becomes an environment where that kind of identity politics flourishes and can become really destructive.
Thank you so much, Deb.
Yeah, I think just a quick word. I think to me, identity politics can refer to two things, and I'm not sure exactly which one you refer to, Michael. By the way, hi, Michael. And whether it is about like feeling being represented by someone who you trust and therefore you can identify with, or is it about having a set vision of your own identity and not ready to accept other parts of your own identity in being represented by any form of institution. And yeah, I think both are sort of dangerous games in a way, because the focus on sort of personal representation, when you think that someone can be sort of pure or perfectly like you, or what you think of yourself, is sort of showing the fact that our society is extremely fragmented, and we lack a lot of collective sort of a compass for collective values and sense of belonging with other groups in society. And I don't know, I don't think I have a remedy to this, but I think, the only sort of thing that we can do is talk about agreement, disagreement, is talk about what activities we agree with, what sort of, what values do we think are good necessarily, and what do we think is bad, in other words.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting insight that clearly the constituents place a greater value in the role that you're fulfilling, as you put it, a servant leader, than who they saw you as an individual. So I think that's a good lesson for politics generally.
I'll just divert. There's a really interesting thing, Michael, about it. So thanks for asking the question. So in this political world we're in, the opposite, the Liberal Party have run an ad in the local paper, in the Border Mail, it comes out every day, and they've run it twice, and it's a big sort of banner thing, and it says, "Helen is not Cathy." And I looked at it and I went, "Oh my God, they picked it up in one, how astute." But the thing is, what they're trying, and they had a lovely photo of me and a lovely photo of Helen, and they're trying, the assumption behind it is I was a pure independent and Helen's a Labor, a Labor Green independent. And then underneath they put our voting record, how many times I voted with the government and how many times Helen does. But I looked at it and I went, well, that is profound. If only they realised how on the ball they are. And so I'm going to respond, and I let it to all the local papers saying, thanks, Liberal Party, for noting that we're not the same. And I haven't quite worked out the words yet, but I'm going to talk about how Helen stands on my shoulders and the community's shoulders. So she's so much greater than what I ever was. I haven't quite worked out how to do it cleverly yet, but I will do it. But I just had to, everybody just had such a chuckle because we don't think they knew what they were doing when they said it, but how they've actually misinterpreted that thing about role.
Pyramid of Indi.
Yeah, yeah.
Great. Well, I think we're actually getting towards the end of time, and it's been such a great discussion. What I thought I might do for the last couple of minutes, we've been through so much territory talking about systems and leadership and interventions and emotion, listening, the power of community, learning, courage. Is there anything that you would like to pick up on? I might go to the reverse order if we start with Pierrick. Any last comments or provocations you would like to give to continue this conversation into the future?
I'm a slow thinker, so I don't know if it could take the entire afternoon to think about something clever to say at the end of this. I don't know. I just think we have a lot of work to do on reconstructing communities and reconstructing collective values, because I think there's one word that we've not pronounced, which is neoliberalism, and I think it's been a key feature of our society in the last 20 years. And the collapse of government, local government services have contributed to fragment society in lots of parts of communities. And I think this is something that we can collectively fight against.
Great, thank you, Cathy. Deb?
I'll go back to where I started, which is that we've got a very short time to turn things around. It needs to be done through our participation in democracy, through our participation in society, through understanding where the system's failing, where to intervene, and throwing ourselves whatever job, whatever influence, however we can use our privilege, the gift of the education that most people in this room have, the networks you have, to try and influence that ship to go in a different direction, because time is short, and it's my plea to everybody.
Thank you, Deb. Cathy?
So, as I said, I want to be part of an ongoing conversation, and we're in the middle of it. So I want you to pay attention to what's happening. And if you had any sort of research capacity, there'd be 4 seats that I'd be saying, can you dive in and have a look at? So the seat of Page, which is Northern Rivers, it's Lismore and Grafton. They've got a really good independent running there. Her name is Hannah Beth Luke. She again is a huge swing, but she's got hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. So they're not going to stop. I mean, they know about climate, they know about the impact. They're not going to stop after this. So some active help to do them reviewing, understanding what do they do next would go well. So that's Page, and the next one down, Cowper, which is Port Macquarie and Coffs Harbour. Kaz Haynes is running there. Now she's got a better chance of getting in. She might become a member of Parliament, but again, she's going to. I was up there the other day, and there was 50 people turned up at luncheon just to talk about campaigning skills. So again, that community is going to want to know, well, what do we do next? How do we do it? So that would be really useful. So that leads me to the bit meta picture. When I think about what next, is that after this election, some independents will get up, some won't. One of the major parties will form government, and they'll be more of the same. So that will go on, but it's not enough to give us the change we need. And I'm with you, the urgency of it. So how do we bring civil society to work to become much more proactive in making our members of Parliament do what we want them to do? So that's the bit I want to think about. And so something like the first weekend in August, we're going to have a Zoom conference for all these people who, like you, Claire, who've been involved in the process, and all their friends. And we're going to have a structured conversation about where the pressure points are. We're going to do it based on issues, so people can nationally group around their issue and have that conversation about, well, where's the opportunity to go forward? And it'll be about housing, it'll be about all the sorts of topics that people hold dear. But what we hope to do is is help people network at the grassroots level, but for me, much more importantly, with the peak bodies. Because I think there's a real disconnect between the peak bodies and all these people on the ground who are just learning about political activism. So if we could somehow bring them together so that the peak bodies could actually start working with the community activism of these groups, and then they could work with their members of parliament, we might be in a bit of a stronger position. So if you want to know more about that, there's a website called communityindependence.com.au, and you can sign up there to go on the mailing list. But that's just one. I'm not at all hopeful that will change the world. It's much bigger than that. And I don't get any sense we've really understood the urgency of the problem, quite frankly.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We've obviously had a huge call to action here. Can I get everyone to join me in thanking our three amazing speakers?